Hey guys, it's Libby and welcome to the March Bard Book Club video. Today we are doing part 1 of Henry VI. So we're kicking off our first tetralogy adventure and we will be reading Henry VI parts 2 and 3 in the coming months, and we're going to cap things off with Richard III. And I feel that I have to start this video off with an apology for making you read this play. Because it was bad. It was really bad. I've read all of Shakespeare's works before, so this is my second time reading it. And the first time I read it, I remember thinking it wasn't good, but this time I was reading it and I was like, wow, this is just really, really, really bad. Which does kind of make it easier to make a Bard Book Club video about it, because like, is there some sort of secret meaning in the poetry, or like deep themes that are layered throughout and intermingle with other themes? No. Not really. Which is kind of good, because it means that I can dedicate the majority of this video to explaining the like historical context, because that is really confusing. There's a lot of characters, most of them go by their titles, sometimes their titles change. You gotta know stuff about like succession law, and it's difficult. So we are gonna get through these Henry VI plays, guys. We're gonna get through them. And when we get to Richard III, we will have such a deep and profound appreciation for everything that is going on. Most people experience Richard III before they experience the Henry VI plays. I was one of those people, and I was like, I don't really know what's going on, but this is kind of interesting. But when I saw Richard III, my first time knowing the 3 plays of prologue, I enjoyed it so much more. So, delayed payoff for this play. I also may have to film this video in several parts because my throat is not doing great. I am also experiencing some chest constriction. It is entirely possible that this is due to allergies. I do not have a cough. I do not at this point have a fever, but I'm not gonna tell you that I don't have coronavirus at this point in time. So I may, for my throat's sake, need to film this over a couple of days. Yep, it's great here in the Netherlands. So a little bit of background as to the writing of this play. It's a hot mess, which may contribute to the fact that this play is a hot mess. No, it's just a mess. It's not even hot. Henry VI Part 1, there's a decent chance that it was written before Henry VI, or sorry, written after Henry VI Parts 2 and 3. So we think originally Henry VI Part 2 was Part 1, Part 3 was Part 2, and then they were like, let's do a prologue, and then that became Henry VI Part 1. And we also are pretty sure that this was a collaboration between multiple playwrights, and that Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, our boy, is not the only author. So hopefully that will perhaps not excuse, but at least explain why this isn't like a super tight narrative. It feels, you know, some of the scenes feel like really unconnected. So I think they had the second 2 plays, and they were like, what are the things that we didn't really talk about that came before that we can sort of write some scenes about? And then a bunch of people wrote different scenes, and like some of them worked together and some of them did not. You should also know that the 4 plays of the first tetralogy cover a really long span of time. Act 1, Scene 1 of the very first play starts in 1422 at the funeral of Henry V. And the last scene of Richard III is going to be in 1485. So we are covering multiple decades, mostly with the same characters. So the characters are getting like older, you know, sometimes there's like months, years between scenes. Also, some of the historical events were like moved around. So sometimes, you know, historically, one thing happened first, but they have another thing happen first in the play, just for dramatic purposes. Sometimes a person was actually dead for an event, but it's convenient for the character to have them be alive at that event, so they have them die afterwards, that sort of thing. So I'm going to be explaining what happens in the play, which is not exactly the same as what historically happens. And this is the point where I make the suggestion to you to go review either the plays or my videos about the second tetralogy, which was written second but actually happened first. None of this is confusing at all. Historically happened first. because there are characters from that play that are still in this play, and obviously the events of the second tetralogy are having an effect on the events of the first tetralogy. So just to highlight the main points and the main characters, this will still take like 20 minutes. So as I said, we start with the funeral of Henry V. Two of his brothers are there, John, Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. He had another brother, don't remember his name, it's not important because he's dead by now, so we don't have to worry about him anymore. So they are now the uncles of the new king, the infant Henry VI. Other people we see there are Henry V's uncles, so Henry VI's great uncles, Exeter, who we did see in Henry V, and the Cardinal, or the Bishop of Winchester, who during the course of this play will become the Cardinal of Winchester. We haven't seen him before, but he is an illegitimate son of John of Gaunt, who you hopefully remember as being like arguably the best character in Richard II. Now, because the new king, Henry VI, was a baby, he was obviously not ruling by himself, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was named the Lord Protector of England. So he's functionally the regent of England while Henry is a child. The Duke of Bedford is the regent of France, of the English holdings in France, because, as you may remember, the whole point of the play Henry V was that England was conquering vast territories in France. Exeter is like largely okay with this. The Cardinal of Winchester, he's a sort of tricky, suspicious dude. I am going to be putting some of my own opinions out here about like which characters are good and which characters are bad. The plays are not super judgmental. And so if, you know, don't, just because I say this is a bad character, don't interpret that as like the play presenting them as a bad character, at least in some cases. So, you know, if you disagree with me, that's cool. And also, again, this is how I'm judging the plays, not how I'm judging actual historical events. So this play is sort of doing two functions that will set us up for the later plays. The first one is showing how the internal bickering between Henry VI's counselors and regents caused such a mess of, you know, disloyalty and, you know, counter alliances, that this caused England to lose all of the lands that it had in France, even though, like, it was, you know, more powerful. They just spent their time fighting each other instead of fighting the French. And the second thing is to introduce the core conflict of the Wars of the Roses, which is what's going to take up the second three plays, or the later three plays. And so that's really important to understand. Like, it's boring succession law, but you need to understand what is the conflict in the Wars of the Roses in order to understand the following plays. There's also a more sort of thematic thing going on, the closest thing that this play has to like its own thing as opposed to just set up for other stuff, and that is the character of Lord Talbot. There's definitely several scenes in this play which is like, hey, Lord Talbot, he's awesome. He's also super English, and he's like super good at fighting, super honorable, gets all his lines in verse, not in prose, because he's great. And so is his son, and they do verse speeches at each other about how much they love each other and how good at fighting they are. True English manhood. So a fair number of scenes in this play are scenes of territory going back and forth between the English and the French. Sometimes they're, you know, the French gain it and then the English take it back and then the French take it back, and then, you know, we move to somewhere else and that all happens again. Which town is being taken and what order it's all being taken in, I can't tell you guys right now, it's not important. I think at least the focus is more on the characters than on the particularities of the plot in those scenes. So the interesting characters we've got, as I mentioned, are John Talbot, and then his foil is Joan la Pucelle, Joan of Arc in the English tongue. So they do make a pun on her name. Pucelle in French means like maiden, but it sounds a lot like puzzle in English, which was a Shakespearean slang term for prostitute. And so there's a lot of hate thrown at Joan of Arc in this play. That's because it's like explicitly anti-Gallican. A lot of English plays of this period were just about hating on the French. It's a very popular topic. So I think the French conception of Joan of Arc has sort of won out in the cultural sphere nowadays. So it is kind of interesting to see people being like, oh no, we hate her, she's awful. Is it sexist? Yes. Yes, it is. Which is another reason that this play is not very good. You may also see the hand of different authors here, because at the sort of the first half of Joan's scenes, she's kind of positively portrayed. Her martial prowess is lauded, largely by the French, but also by the English. They respect her. They're kind of surprised that she's a woman and she's doing these things, but they're like, she is really good at fighting. And then in the second half, a whole bunch of crazy shit happens. She summons some demons, and they're like, aha, she said she was talking to God, but really she was talking to demons. And then there's this scene where she rejects her father because he is poor, and she's like, I am not the child of a poor man. And then at the end, when she's being condemned to death, she says, you can't kill me because I'm pregnant, and she lists all of these other characters that we've seen as potential fathers, and I really don't know if we're meant to interpret that as she's lying to save her life, or if we're meant to interpret that as she actually did have sex with all these men and was just any one of them could be the father. Either way, it's supposed to be no, French woman, bad. We don't like French women. Okay, enough theme stuff. Let's get down into some of the nitty-gritty of the politics behind the Wars of the Roses. So in this play, we don't really know how the conflict gets started. We're in a scene in London in the Temple Gardens. We enter in the middle of a conversation between Richard Plantagenet, Warwick, Somerset, and Suffolk, and a couple of other people who aren't important. And they are already in some sort of disagreement, presumably over a point of law. And it's probably unimportant. This sort of escalates into people choosing sides between Suffolk and Richard Plantagenet, and they signify which side they're on by plucking roses off of bushes. Red roses are, oh crap, I should know this. Red roses are Plantagenet, white roses are Suffolk. And this is all going to explode into a vast civil war that envelops the whole country, because Suffolk is a loyalist to the king, Henry VI. And as we learn right at the end of the play, his loyalty is not really because he thinks the king is so great, but because he thinks he can control the king. Because at the end of the play, we see Suffolk, who is married, fall in love with the young Margaret of Anjou, daughter of the King of Naples, and the titular King of Naples and titular King of Jerusalem. A titular king means you are king in title only. You don't actually control any lands. He falls in love with her, but he can't marry her because he's already married, so he offers her, he sort of arranges a marriage between King Henry and Margaret, and he plans to make Margaret his paramour so that he can control her, and through her control the young king. So the White Rose Party, or the Lancastrians, as we will eventually start calling them, are loyalists to the king. Then Richard Plantagenet, I'll tell you right now, he is the father of Richard III. They're both named Richard. They will both be alive and be important characters in later plays. It will be confusing. So just to keep things clear, the dad, right now he's being called Richard Plantagenet. He will eventually be called the Duke of York. His son, the son Richard, will eventually become Richard III, but in the intermediate time, he will be the Duke of Gloucester. Currently, there is another character who is the Duke of Gloucester. I told you it would be confusing. So after this rose-picking scene, Richard Plantagenet goes to see his uncle, Mortimer, who you should remember from the Richard II plays. Now this Mortimer character is actually a conflation of two different historical characters, so it gets to be like a little bit tricky explaining the succession stuff, but basically Mortimer tells his nephew Richard Plantagenet that he Mortimer is the rightful heir to the throne, and since he is old and about to die, his right to the throne is being transferred to Richard. And here is the reasoning that he gives, which is not bad reasoning, for why he and his nephew upon his death are the rightful heir to the throne. It all has to do with what went down in the play Richard II. They're all connected. You gotta read these 8 plays together, guys. So, Edward III was King of England from 1327 to 1377. When he died, he left 4 sons. Edward, the Black Prince of Wales, who was actually dead before his father, and so his son, Richard II, became king in infancy, or young adulthood, or he was 9. Richard II was forced to abdicate by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Now, Henry IV was the son of John of Gaunt, and John of Gaunt was the 3rd son that we care about by Edward III. So there's another son of Edward III between Edward the Black Prince and John of Gaunt, and that is Lionel, Duke of Clarence. So the issue at stake is that Mortimer and Richard Plantagenet are going to be arguing that Richard II did not have the right to abdicate in favor of someone who was not supposed to be the heir anyway. He is allowed to abdicate, but he doesn't get to choose his successor. The successor has to be the next person in line for the throne, which would be the children of Lionel, Duke of Clarence. The counter-argument is going to be that Henry IV seized the throne, so he does not hold it by legal right, he holds it by right of arms. However, if you read Richard II, they make it quite clear that he is not the king by right of arms. They do the legal process of abdication. Richard II was written after this play, so I don't think we should necessarily take that as putting a judgment on who is correct in this play, although I'm not going to say we hardcore shouldn't either. So Richard Plantagenet is the, I believe, great-great-grandson of Lionel, Duke of Clarence. He is the most direct primogenitor, determined descendant of Lionel, Duke of Clarence, and so therefore upon the death of his uncle, he technically should be king. So he's going to be arguing, I should be king as the most direct primogenitor line, from Edward III, and we should correct the succession when we realize there is an error in it. Counter-argument is Henry IV was not ruling, he was ruling by right of arms, and once you change how the succession works, you should just go with it. You don't do like a correction later. That's going to be our main conflict. And guys, honestly, I don't feel great, and that is all I have to say about this play. It's not great. It will pay off. If you did not do so for this play, for the second play in this tetralogy, I cannot recommend highly enough that while you are reading it, you are looking at a character list. I recommend the character list on Wikipedia. They have things broken down by like which groups of characters are most likely to be seen with each other. This does contain a spoiler, but it's like historical events, so it already happened. Can history be a spoiler? I don't really think so. Secondly, don't worry about spoilers. The play's not that good. You won't care. Thirdly, Shakespeare's original audience would have known, who was going to die. It reveals who dies. Shakespeare's original audience would have known that, so you are not... you're actually getting, a closer experience to the original experience if you know who's going to die. And even if you don't like spoilers, I'm just going to tell you that Henry VI Part 2 has the most characters of any Shakespeare play. There are so many characters. It's really hard to keep track of them all. You will want assistance. So I'm gonna sign off and consume cough drops and drink lots of tea and, you know, try not to die. I hope y'all are having a nice March, a nice self-isolation time, and everything's not going too bad for you. I will see you next month for what may not be exactly a better play, but it's certainly a more coherent play. Like, all of the scenes were kind of more meant to go together. So, you know, hang tight. We'll get through it. You just have to get through these plays, and then, like, most of the other ones are a lot better, and this is definitely the hardest part of being a Shakespeare completionist. But we're gonna do it. Okay, see you later.